Good morning, everyone. We're going to come to order here in just a moment. How are we doing on the Zoom issues, Molly? We're checking on Zoom connectivity. We've got some folks dialing in that way. Molly, can we go forward? Okay, great. Well, good morning. Glad to see everyone. I want to begin as we do our meetings here at the Capitol with morning prayer. Senator Ed Harbison, would you please open us in prayer this morning? What is your mic number, Senator? All right. Yes, sir. Thank you.
If you bow with me, Father God, thank you for this day and the opportunity to do godly things. Thank you, Father. Bless our contemplations here and our meditations and our legislation, and let us do the right thing, because everything that is wrong in the eyes of people who want to do right need to be fixed. Thank you, Father, for your blessings. Bless us all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Senator. Well, good morning again, everyone. I want to thank everyone for making the trip today. We are continuing an open process for drawing the maps in Georgia. Our first phase was a hearing, or multiple hearings from the public. And as you know, we held 11 hearings over the past few months as part of our summer road show to have open dialogue with the public and receive information from folks that wanted to come and share their thoughts. And I think that was it was a good and successful process. We've also heard more than 20 hours of public testimony and had 328 individuals speak to us at those various meetings. We've been on the road driving more than 1,400 miles and covering almost all of Georgia's House and Senate districts. And I want to thank all the legislators and the committee members, House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, who travel the state, and I also want to thank you for being here this morning as well. Now that we've received the census data, it's time for us to adopt guidelines and begin working on drawing the maps. But before we adopt guidelines this afternoon, we thought it would be helpful for the committee to have, for us to have interested groups come and speak to us, and also have the opportunity for committee members to ask questions about the process. To that end, we've invited a variety of Republican, Democrat, and nonpartisan groups who are interested in the process, and many have approached Chairman Rich and I and said that they wanted to have conversations with us, and so we have set up those meetings at that request. So today, we're going to hear from the National Conference of State Legislatures and other groups. We've also extended invitations to the Georgia Republican Party and the National Republican Redistricting Trust to participate as well. But they politely declined the invitation. The Georgia NAACP initially said they wanted to present, but we did not hear back from them after and despite our efforts to follow up. Our plan today is to hear 10 minutes or so from each presentation or group, followed by about 10 minutes or so questions from committee members to have that time to ask questions. Before we begin the process, I want to ask and thank Gina Wright, who has done just a fantastic job to prepare everyone that you see here today to go about this process. And Gina, any comments you'd like to make or to introduce your folks that are here as we begin this process? Yes, Chairman Rich has an announcement.
I just wanted to let everyone know who may be watching via live stream that is the mechanism for you to participate in today's hearing, unless you are a member of one of these committees or you are a speaker who has signed up to speak. Only those individuals will receive an invitation to the Zoom room. But if you know of someone who is wanting to participate, please invite them to log on to the live stream that they can find through either the House or the Senate website. Thank you.
Rich, for having us here today and for hosting this meeting. As she said, my name is Gina Wright. I'm the Executive Director of your Office of Legislative and Congressional Reapportionment. We're a joint office of the General Assembly, and we help both the House and the Senate, so we're here for all of you. I'd like to take just a minute and introduce my staff. You probably don't see them all the time because they're usually busy doing things in the office, but I had them come today just so we could introduce them, and you can put a name and a face together. First, we have Brian Knight. Just stand if you want. Brian's our local redistricting coordinator. He'll be doing a lot of work with the redistricting process with county commissions, county school boards, city councils, but he'll also be helping in other capacities as well. So this is Brian. Rob Strangia is our GIS manager. He does a lot of our computer stuff, kind of in the background doing things, working, keeping our software working and updated and doing the things it should. So this is Rob. Dan O'Connor. Dan does a lot of data analysis for us, working with numbers and things like that and analyzing data and trends and things. So this is Dan. Maggie Wigton is a new member of our staff, so she is just learning and we are really excited to have her on board. She is going to be doing a lot of work with local redistricting. There's a lot that goes into all of our 159 counties, so she'll be helping Brian out with local work this year. And Tanya Cooper is our office manager. She's who you get when you call, or if you come in, you get to talk to Tanya, and she always keeps us laughing and on our toes. So we appreciate Tanya and all she does for us. And we have one other staff person who isn't here yet, an appointment this morning, and his name is Gabe Mizraya. And Gabe is also a new staff member this year, and he, along with Maggie, will be doing a lot of work with the local redistricting as well. So we're really excited to be here, ready for this process, ready to go and ready to help you in any capacity that we can. And we just thank you for having us here today and letting us be available and introduce ourselves to you. All right, guys, you're good to go.
Bye. Thank you, Gina. Thank you for that. Thanks for the introduction. So we know who's going to be helping us so much going forward. All right, we're about ready to start. I neglected to introduce myself. I'm John Kennedy. I chair the Senate Redistricting Committee, serve the 18th District, and along with Chairman Rich, who chairs the House Redistricting Committee. She and I are co-chairing these meetings as we have the public hearings, and we're going to do the same for today. So she and I will be both jumping in and out as chair during the course of the day. So Chairman Rich, any other comments before we get started? Okay, very good. First to sign up, NCSL. Good morning. If you would, when you get to the podium, introduce yourself, and the floor will be yours.
Chair Kennedy, Chair Rich, my name is Ben Williams. I'm with the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Elections and Redistricting Program. It's a pleasure to be here in Atlanta today with all of you. I was asked to talk about the census and race and redistricting, and I have 10 minutes to do it. So this is going to be quite the rushed presentation. So just know that there's a lot more to what I'm going to say than will be said in this hearing. So if you have any further questions, I'm happy to speak with all of you. Let me see if I can get this going. There we go. For those of you who don't know who the National Conference of State Legislatures is, we are the nation's preeminent organization serving the needs of legislators and legislative staff. Our structure is bipartisan and our work is nonpartisan. All 7,383 state legislators in the United States are members of NCSL, as are the more than 25,000 legislative staff throughout the country. Our structure is completely bipartisan. We have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans in our governing structure, and they rotate who's at the top every year. And our work is intended to be informational. We do not recommend policy advice to legislators or legislative staff, but we do provide 50 state information that can help guide you in the decisions that you make. So the first point is that the census matters. And I've included some information about the amount of federal funding that is earmarked to Georgia each year, according to programs that follow the census data for the financial allocation. And in 2016, it was $23.8 billion per year were given to Georgia by the federal government or allocated to Georgia through the federal government funds like Medicare and Medicaid that are earmarked to census information. And this is just to show that there's a financial side to this in addition to a redistricting side. I think the most important thing in 5 minutes about the census to highlight for you is that the census data was delayed. There were a number of reasons for that, coming 4.5 months later than it was set to according to federal law. And the primary reason for that was the pandemic. If you think about Census Day was April 1st of 2020, what was going on Census Day last year? States were in lockdown, people couldn't go anywhere. It was almost impossible to get outside. I know that in Denver, we had rules that we couldn't drive more than 10 miles from where we lived. So there are lots of these problems with getting that information out on April 1st. And it took the Census Bureau a long time to do follow-up. And part of that follow-up was let's see, there we go. Part of that follow-up was hampered by fires out west, floods in the deep south, primarily related to hurricanes. So just know that there were a lot of problems that the Census Bureau had to face that they didn't necessarily have to face in prior decades that led to some of the slowdown. These next two slides are just to give you a sense of how delayed redistricting is this year compared to 2011. So this is a map that shows you how much redistricting had progressed in 2011 relative to now. All of the states in blue are states that haven't started redistricting at all yet. So this is 2011. This is August 2021. The other important thing about the census is that it has filters within it to protect the privacy of respondents. And this is known as disclosure avoidance. This is one of the census's two dual mandates. They have mandates to protect respondent privacy and to provide accurate data at the block level. In the past, the Census Bureau has used something called data swapping to protect respondent privacy, which means that if you had two households respond to the census and they were, let's say, 2 adults, 2 children living in one home, and they were in blocks adjacent to one another, the Census Bureau would swap those files so that the block level data would be accurate. It would tell you that there are 2 adults and 2 children living in a particular house. But if you were able to get into the actual records, if somehow the privacy filter were to be broken, the record that would show in the census data file would actually be someone who lived maybe 10 or 20 miles away. It wouldn't be that household of 4. So the top line number would be the same, but the actual record might be different. The Census Bureau determined that that method of protecting privacy could be broken through sophisticated algorithms and quantum computing. And so they developed a new method for protecting privacy known as differential privacy. And the problem for you is that this involves introducing error, intentional error, into the census numbers that you see in the census data set. So on the picture of this slide is actually directly from the Census Bureau, but on the picture to your left, you see a series of numbers. Let's call that the actual enumeration that the Census Bureau took. And the chart on the right are the numbers that the Census Bureau reported to the states. So you can see a 14 turned into a 13, a 50 turned into a 51, a 26 turned into a 25. So there are slight inaccuracies introduced into the data. And the point of that is so it's more difficult, or in theory impossible, for someone who applies an advanced algorithm or compares the census data with other data sets to actually unmask who respondents are and to protect the privacy of people who responded to the United States Census. What's the impact of that for you? I think the most important one is that only state total population will be reported without noise. So when you have your Georgia state total population reported by the Census Bureau, that's correct. That's exactly what they counted. But the numbers below that will have a slowly increasing amount of error introduced into it, and the greatest amount of error will be in the census blocks. You'll notice that the distortions are larger in small populations and smaller in large populations. That's primarily an effect of math. If you change one census block from 5 to 6 and one block from 80 to 81, obviously the proportion of change is much higher from 5 to 6 than 80 to 81. So that's the census. Now 5 minutes on race. The most important thing about race to understand in redistricting is that you are required to consider it under the Voting Rights Act, but you're only allowed to consider it when necessary according to the Equal Protection Clause. And that's because you have 2 conflicting doctrines at play here. The first one is, under the Voting Rights Act, is districts must be drawn when, if it applies, to enable a minority group to have the opportunity to elect its candidate of choice. That doctrine has not changed even after the recent Voting Rights Act case at the U.S. Supreme Court, Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee. I'm sure all of you have heard about this case. That case is related to vote denial, which is a different standard under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act from vote dilution, which applies to redistricting. So just know that even if that case may indicate the future trajectory of the Supreme Court as it relates to the Voting Rights Act and how it considers it in these cases, the doctrine as it relates to redistricting has not changed in the past year. So the doctrine that applied in 2011 is the doctrine that applies now. Under the only one necessary is because of the racial gerrymandering doctrine under the Equal Protection Clause. And that says that you can only consider race as so long as it is not the predominant consideration in the construction of a district. I will note, I added a but note here. That's just to say that a group that happens to be all of one race may have other interests that bind them together as well. You may have heard about this in your public hearings. The example that I often hear and that I heard when I was in North Dakota last week testifying in a very similar situation before their legislature was meat packers in rural districts. Sometimes they have shared interests related to school funding or public education or environmental issues that bind them together. And even though they may all be majority Latino or majority Asian, the reasons that they want districts to be constructed are not racial in nature. It's because of economic interests or other interests that bind them together. So just to give you some brief info on racial gerrymandering, this is the original racial gerrymander on the slide. This is North Carolina's 12th congressional district. It's probably the most litigated congressional district in the United States. This is the district as it existed from 1991 to 1993. And the test under racial gerrymandering is predominance. And here's the logic of it. I will say, if you go ask your counsel, is this the exact test? They will tell you yes, but it's simplified. There's more to it than this. But just to give you the general gist, a racial gerrymandering legal analysis starts with, did race predominate, which means 50% plus one of the reason, in the creation of a particular district? If yes, was the predominant use of race required either A, by the Voting Rights Act, or B, to remedy past racial discrimination? If the answer is yes, then that's okay. The district is upheld. It's valid. If no, the district is invalid and must be redrawn. The other side of this coin is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It prohibits vote dilution. It applies nationwide, not just to Georgia, to every state in the US. And the burden of proof is discriminatory effect. So plaintiffs don't need to prove that the legislature had discriminatory intent in the creation of a line. They only need to prove that the resulting district had a discriminatory effect on the minority group in question. Now, you may say that's a pretty broad standard. How do you know when that applies to anybody? And that's where the jingles preconditions come into the Section 2 analysis. These were introduced by the US Supreme Court in the 1980s to help legislators understand when a Section 2 district needs to be drawn. And there are these 3 threshold levels, and I will actually go through each of these because they're pretty important. So the first one is the minority group in question sufficiently large and geographically compact in such a way that the voting age population could constitute the majority of a particular district? The second 2 prongs are known as racially polarized voting. And so the first one is the minority group politically cohesive? Just to give you an example, you may have groups like Latinos in South Florida who are not politically cohesive. You have a lot of different voting preferences among that group. There may be very mixed Democratic and Republican. They might not satisfy the political cohesion prong here to qualify for Voting Rights Act protection. But let's assume a racial minority group is politically cohesive. Then the third question is, does the white population around them vote as a block to thwart the minority group's ability to elect their candidate of choice? Essentially, is there enough white vote that also votes for the minority group's preferred candidate of choice to the point that there's no legal requirement that a district be drawn in a certain way because there isn't racially polarized voting in that area anymore? And this is something that you see sometimes in Virginia, where the threshold, Virginia is a good example in the past decade, where the threshold for the percentage of Black voting age population in a particular district has gone down as more and more of the population votes for the preferred candidate of the Black community in those areas. If a plaintiff satisfies all 3 of the jingles preconditions, then the analysis shifts over to the Senate factors. The Senate factors come from the United States Senate's reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1982. Just know that this is a totality of the circumstances analysis. This is not a checklist. Plaintiffs don't have to prove every single prong on these Senate factors. It's just something holistically that judges considering these cases look at. The last point of the Voting Rights Act is that sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 technically still exists. This is the pre-clearance regime that Georgia and several other states were subject to for many decades. That is still the valid law of the land, but after Shelby County versus Holder, it applies to 0 jurisdictions in the United States. Congress could, in theory, pass a new coverage formula to determine which jurisdictions are subject to pre-clearance. They have not done so. So for this decade, the Section 5 pre-clearance will apply to exactly 0 jurisdictions in the United States, state or local. The key takeaways are that in the census, I think it's the most important thing is that the smaller the unit of geography, the greater the amount of noise will be in the data. So just know that when you're looking at that block level data in the census file, that's the level that has the greatest amount of error. The error decreases the higher up you go through the census geographies. You have lots of excellent data experts here that you can ask, and I'm sure they would be more than willing to help you with that. And just know that there's never been a perfect census. So when you hear things about this census and criticisms of this census, just know that all censuses throughout history have had criticism, and none of them have gotten an exactly perfect count of the population. And the US Supreme Court has blessed those counts and considered them to be accurate. On race, I think it's important to know that it's a balancing act. The Supreme Court guidance can be unclear, and I think this is really, really important. What's true today and what I'm telling you now might not be the law when your maps are being judged. In the 1990s, when the Georgia legislature was redrawing districts, racial gerrymandering doctrine didn't exist. And then the districts were struck down 5 years later under racial gerrymandering doctrine. How could the Georgia legislature have known that that doctrine was what they were going to be judged against? The Voting Rights Act doctrines could change between now and whenever maps end up in court. Racial gerrymandering doctrine could change between now and when districts end up in court. So just know this is a constantly evolving area of law, and just keep in touch with your counsel and they can update you on the most recent developments. And NCSL tracks recent developments as well in the law on our website. Normally I delete this slide. This is in our overall deck that we have at NCSL, but I just wanted to brag a little bit on the Georgia staff who do such a wonderful job, including Martha Wigton, who is NCSL staff chair. I'm sure many of you might have worked with her before if you've worked on budget policy at all. She's been an absolute delight to work with over the past 2 years. And I love working with her. And also just to give a shout out to Gina, because Gina is one of the staffers that we rely on for national redistricting expertise at NCSL. And so you're blessed with a plethora of wonderful staff here in Georgia. So I just wanted to make sure I acknowledge that. And with that, I'm available for any questions that you have. Thank you for including me in this hearing.
All right. Thank you, sir. That was very helpful. Representative Ballinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given that you explained with regards to the noise and the differential privacy and how the noise was introduced to try to put that away, how do we deal with using the demographic data as it's presented by the U.S. Census with the noise injected to draw lines that comply with the Voting Rights Act?
I think you can only use the information that was given to you. I mean, you can ask the staff that assists both of the committees with how that data can be used. In general, the Supreme Court in the past has blessed census data and said that despite any inaccuracies that may exist, we consider it to be accurate. This is a new method of privacy protection, so I can't say for certain that the Supreme Court would bless this too, but it is worth noting that when the Census Bureau gets sued, it usually wins. And so this is one of those situations where the blessing of the data may indeed come, and there has always been some amount of error in the data set. And to the extent that you have it, it's probably just in a situation where you can just have to do the best you can with it, which I realize is a somewhat unsatisfactory answer, but unfortunately that just is the answer.
So it hasn't been the subject of litigation yet.
It has been litigated to a certain extent in Alabama. There was a lawsuit in Alabama challenging the Census Bureau's use of differential privacy, and it was dismissed on standing grounds. The court said that it wasn't ripe yet because the data hadn't come out, so they didn't know exactly how much differential privacy would be applied. That case is not technically dead. It could still come back. So just know that there is litigation out there, but nothing to this point that would change the status quo.
Representative Jackson?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Can you explain a little more in detail regarding pre-clearance in Section 5? You said that it still exists, but 0 jurisdictions will be affected by it. Can you go into a little more detail about that for me?
Absolutely. Chair Kennedy, Representative Jackson. So Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required that certain jurisdictions, according to a formula that Congress set, would need to pre-clear their maps or get pre-approval for any changes to election laws, whether they be related to voting or the Supreme Court has said also redistricting. And that structure existed for several years. Congress never changed the formula from how it was structured when the Voting Rights Act was initially passed in 1965. And the Supreme Court said in a case in 2013 that while the pre-clearance regime itself, if you want to think about it that way, the idea of pre-clearance as a method for protecting the rights of minorities was a valid exercise of federal power. The formula, since it had not been changed in 50 years, was a violation of the principles of federalism. And so that formula was struck down as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said that Congress was free to pass a new coverage formula to redetermine which jurisdiction should be subject to Section 5 preclearance. But Congress hasn't done that in the 8 years since Shelby County versus Holder. And so that's the situation that we're currently in, which is that the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, is still constitutional. It's still valid law. If Congress were to pass a new coverage formula and determine new jurisdictions that could be subject to it, it could be reenacted. But as of this point, no bill has passed both chambers of Congress and gone to the president's desk. I will note that the John Lewis Voting Rights Authorization Act, I might have butchered the name, passed the House of Representatives. I looked at the formula that it would cover, and it's mostly the same states. I think New York would be subject to preclearance now. That was not the case before. And Los Angeles County, I believe, would be subject to preclearance. But just note that there is legislation in Congress that could do something, but to reauthorize Section 4. But as of this time, there is no Section 4 to apply to any jurisdictions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Representative Alexander, are you 29? Is that right? Okay, you've got the mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you explain a little bit about the two different datas being released? Like the recent data and the more forthcoming data that's going to be released?
Yes, absolutely. So the data that's coming in September will be the same data that was released on August 12th on the website. Now, it will come in a different format. So the Census Bureau this decade decided that they wanted to release data in what they called a user-friendly format that the public could use more accessibly. That was before all of the pandemic and all of the delays occurred that set the Census Bureau back in their timeline. And so when the Census Bureau was trying to figure out how to catch up, be less late than they were, they realized that they were going to have the data available in a not as user-friendly format sometime in mid-August. And that the data, the normal data, the actual release of data, if you want to consider it that, would be still on September 30th, but they could get the redistricting data to the states 6 weeks earlier so that they could start their redistricting processes, because there are many states that have very early redistricting deadlines. And NCSL and those states were telling them, you need to get the data out as quickly as you can so that states can do this. And the Census Bureau did get it out on August 12th. There will not be, according to the Census Bureau, we have asked many times, and they've told us many times, that the data that comes out on September 30th or by September 30th will be the same as the data that came out on August 12th. So you won't have any changes into the data set. That's from the Census Bureau. I'm obviously not privy to the internal decision-making of the United States Census Bureau, but we've asked many times, and that's what we have been told. So that's the best answer I can give.
All right, thank you. And we will conclude the questioning with Senator Gooch. I'll recognize you for a question. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Ben, thank you for what you do with NCSL, and we appreciate all the work you've done over the years helping our legislative efforts. Do most states, that, based on your research, still use plus or minus 5% deviation in legislative districts, or they use something other than that?
Mr. Chair, Senator Gooch. So the answer is it's usually lower. States usually have a lower guideline. That plus or minus 5% is the ceiling set by the Supreme Court for how high legislative districts can go. There are some states that like to keep it up that high as possible. And just to give you an example, in Wyoming, they like to keep it fairly high because they like to keep counties whole. So they like to have as much wiggle room as they can. So it does vary from state to state, but most states keep it much tighter. Sometimes they have constitutional language that keeps it around plus or minus 1%, plus or minus 2%. But I would say the generally average deviation is somewhere between plus or minus 2 or 3%.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much. Thanks for that very informative presentation. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate you having traveled to share your opinion. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. All right, next we have Common Cause.
Good morning, y'all. I'm Anna Dennis, Executive Director for Common Cause Georgia. Thank you for having us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for being here.
So particularly this morning, we're going to focus on home rule and redistricting. So the agenda, we're going to talk about Georgia Home Rule redistricting provisions, best practices and municipal redistricting, the impacts and outstanding questions. The basics of home rule redistricting. So this is governed by Georgia Code 28-1-14. This was established in 2019. It applies to county boards of commissions, all 159 of them, county boards of education, 159 of them, independent boards of education, and municipal authorities, which is 535. Local government entities may request that the LCRC draw their district maps, and also local government entities may draw their own maps and have the LCRC must approve. So the process for the LCRO approval, this is part one, there's two parts to it. So the entity must obtain a sponsorship letter from a member of the General Assembly, which presents the entity authority authorizing the LCR to review the plan. The LCR conducts a technical review to determine the compliance with federal and Georgia constitutional requirements, the compliance under the VRA, whether the plan is divides current precincts in a way that will compromise voters' autonomy, whether the plan leaves geographics unassigned, and whether the plan maintains continuous geographic features, and any other concerns that the LCRO may determine legally relevant. So part two of the process. If the plan passes the technical review, the LCR issues a certification form to the local entity. The local entity votes to adopt the plan and then submit to the General Assembly. The LCRO prepares legal description of the plan to submit to the Office of Legislative Counsel to draft the local legislation. Part three. If the LCRO finds the technical issues, it will notify the local government entity and the member of the General Assembly. The local government entity may choose either to have the LCRO make corrections or the original preparer. If the original preparer makes corrections, it must be resubmitted to the LCRO to review. So the mapping criteria. So Ben just kind of went over some of this. So we want to follow the equal population, compliance to the VRA, and continuity. So what we're suggesting is that there's protections for communities of interest and prohibition of partisan gerrymandering. So here are some best practices for local redistricting. And we've looked at these best practices across the states because Common Cause is a national organization, and we have over 23 states where we have state offices. So we want to prioritize transparency. So we conduct map making public meetings. We want publicized internal redistricting priorities, publicized hearings, drafts of maps through multiple avenues. We also want to provide accessible options for meaningful input. I know you all have did like the traveling across the state, and we definitely commend you all on putting in those efforts. But we also want to see a website portal that accepts public comments as well as community of interest maps, hearings scheduled at multiple times and days of the week. That makes it more accessible for every type of Georgian who's working to be able to engage in the process, and also language translation. We also would like to see a hire of nonpartisan experts to work through the procurement process. This may include map drawing, GIS, looking at experts for the Voting Rights Acts, and also looking at ways that we can create communication and outreach channels. And so these are some best practices that we've seen across the states. So here are some impacts. So the impacts would be local entities having direct impact on their daily lives, and poorly constructed local districts maps can impact voting precincts, which definitely matters. So here are some outstanding questions. Does the LCRC have sufficient resources to review maps approximately for 1,000 entities? If not, how will the General Assembly address the need? If experts are hired, will there be a public procurement process? What is the timeline? How long can municipal entities expect the review draft of their maps to take? How will the LCRC determine compliance with the criteria, particularly the protecting the autonomy of a voter criteria? In the event that the LCRC is drawing maps, will there be opportunities for public testimony to review the maps? How will the LCRC incorporate public input? May the municipalities, entities request changes to the maps produced by the LCRC? So that's all I have for you today.
Thank you, ma'am. All right. I want to recognize Representative Ballinger. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, and I appreciate your presentation and being with us here today. Twice in your slides, it says anonymity, and both times you said autonomy, and those are different.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what should I strike out, anonymity and put autonomy, or what word was meant there?
I was technically using them interchangeable, but I realized they're not interchangeable. However, we do see that we want that to be where local districts can have a say in their process and know more about how the process will be conducted. So that's what that's been. So thank you for the question.
Okay. Chairman Rich.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for being here. You had mentioned in your presentation that the local districts need to protect the precincts. Are you saying that you think that the precincts need to be kept as whole as possible? Is that what you believe we should be working toward?
I believe precincts should be kept as whole as possible. However, we do know that precinct surveying happens with the counties. However, if maps aren't drawn correctly and districts aren't drawn correctly, sometimes you'll have precincts that are placed in the wrong district. So technically voters, we will be voting for the wrong candidate. So that can present a problem where these elections and contests will have to be done over. So to make it very streamlined, we do want to protect the wholeness of precincts, or making sure that precincts are drawn correctly because maps are drawn in the most accurate phases.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Chairman Cowsert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your materials, you mentioned that it's your belief that we're required to comply with Federal Voting Rights Act on these local redistricting issues as well. I'm curious, do you believe that we need to comply with Section 2 to draw as many minority districts as possible?
I do believe that we should follow the federal guidelines. It's been mentioned that right now, because we do have legislation that's in Congress, that there are parts of it that's in flux. But I do believe that we should be following jingles, and we should be looking at districts that are Section 203 districts that are complying with disabilities parts. But I'm not gonna, because I was just about to get into legalese and go through the different codes. But I do believe that we should be following the federal guidelines. And when we're following those federal guidelines, because we do know there are things in flux, there should be more transparency in the process, because we know that could create some type of confusion for community members to voters who are also vested in this process, because we know that there may be different ordinances that may come later in the process. So we want to make sure that everyone knows more about how this process stands, because we know there will be some influx. Thank you for the question.
Is it your belief that voting is racially polarized in Georgia?
Wow, I'm not going to actually tell that part of it. I do believe in Georgia. That we are in a political influx of how we do vote here, but I will not speak on the polarization of voting. I will let my friends and partners in the my friends and partners and advocates groups speak to that issue, but thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Representative Nix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Ms. Dennis, for your presentation. As we look at the things that you're talking about, we're really getting down to the local area with municipal redistricting and all. So we start talking about communities of interest. How would you define a community of interest? What what would you put into the definition there that would be included to make it a community of interest?
So I'll give you a few examples. So as Ben mentioned, there could be a community of interest where you have workers who are in a agriculture or a meat packing district, and they may have a interest in like the rural educational provisions because they know that we need to have more agricultural and rural training of technical skills for students. So they may have a interest in that. You also may have districts or groups who may have an interest in having there be cohesiveness in their districts because of things that connect them together, like having a language component that connects them together. You also may have folks who want to be connected in a district because they care about having hospitals or having more COVID testing sites or COVID vaccination sites available in their district. So there are different ways that we can put communities of interest together. So there's different ways that groups look at how community of interest are put together. And I know that Fair Districts Georgia and Galeo and Agents of Advancing Justice Georgia and ACLU, I know they'll also speak on what could possibly be community of interest as well.
Okay, thank you. May I follow up?
Yes, sir.
As we look at this idea of a community of interest and also in the idea of compactness, how do you distinguish between the two? Which one's most important? If you've got these different areas that may be scattered out, how do you combine them? Is being compact more important or the community of interest more important?
I wouldn't say that they're equally less important. I think that they are both important to communities. They're definitely important to how a district is drawn. So I would not separate the two and say that one is more important than the other.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. So with that, Ms. Dennis, thank you very much for being here with us this morning. All right, next we will have the ACLU.
Oh, you know.
Morning, Mr. Bruce. Nice to see
Hey,
you.
good to see you too, Chairman.
Welcome. The podium is yours.
Happy to be here. And to all the other members of the Joint Redistricting Committee, thank you for being here today. And thank you for allowing the ACLU of Georgia to speak. My name is Christopher Bruce. I'm the Policy Director of the ACLU of Georgia. I am joined by our Legal Director, Sean Young, who will be speaking as well. And the purpose of this is to let you know that the ACLU is 100% into redistricting. The political department, the legal department, all of the departments, as well as our executive director, have made redistricting a priority since we've gotten it here. And let me tell you a little bit about the ACLU if you haven't heard of it before. We really envision a state that guarantees civil rights and civil liberties to all Georgians that are enshrined in our United States Constitution, as well as our Georgia Constitution. And we do that through three different ways. That's with legal action, really more legislative advocacy, and of course, civic engagement within your communities that you represent. So representing the ACLU, we have members in all 159 counties in the state of Georgia. And we were talking to our members, we were really asking them, what do they want in the redistricting process? Now, if you were in the General Assembly back in 2018, you may have been familiar with another piece of legislation called the Democracy Act. It really called for fairness and standards and transparency within the redistricting process. So this presentation may not be too new to you because we're asking for the same thing, really asking for transparency within this process, meaningful public input, making it easier for people to be able to comment on the process, and of course, a reflection of the diversity in our state. We received the census data. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I do want to recognize some highlights of this altogether. The total population of Georgia has gone up 10.6%. That is an incredible increase for this state's population. And looking at the factors that go within it, of a -1% for the non-Hispanic white population, the Black population jumping plus 12%, the Asian population jumping over 50%, and of course the Hispanic population jumping over 30% as well. So not only looking at that, let's look at the standards that go within the voting age population within the state of Georgia. Still an increase that's happening of over 14% in the voting age population overall. Non-Hispanic whites jumping up again 2%, the Black population over 18%, Asian 57%, and the Hispanic population of 37%. So those are some brief numbers, but we can get some takeaways from that altogether. Looking at the Black voting age population, which grew significantly within the last decade of over 19%. So to put that in perspective, back in last redistricting times of 2010, you had 45 Black majority districts in the state of Georgia. Even with the Black population age growing, it has currently cut down to 42. So looking at, despite the growth in the Black population, there are actually fewer Black majority districts that are enacted under the current acts, the current maps that we're currently under. Now, the Black voting age population has grown significantly, and it's really realized with an increased overpacking in overpopulated districts, something that you should take into consideration. So the growth and diversity in the state of Georgia is just going to continue as projected for the years to come. We need to take into consideration a lot of things, including the children factor within this when it comes to increasing the population, which leads to the risk of gerrymandering altogether. The Brennan Center has said itself that the state with the highest risk for gerrymandering is the state of Georgia. So again, Georgia is leading within one factor within this altogether. Georgia's maps may not require pre-clearance under the current, in the next redistricting cycle due to the Shelby case, but this committee should make sure and ensure that maps comply with federal and constitutional requirements to avoid legal standards. And going into those legal standards, I'm going to bring up my legal director, Sean Young. Sean?
Thanks for having me, and I'll try not to be too repetitive. The legal requirements for redistricting involve the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the U.S. Constitution. Under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, it requires that people of color have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and elect candidates of their choice. The analysis is based on the totality of the circumstances. And basically, Section 2 forbids redistricting maps that dilute the voting power of people of color. As has been covered earlier, very briefly, vote dilution can be established if the following jingles preconditions have been met. A district can be drawn in which a minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact to constitute a majority. The minority group is politically cohesive, and white majority voters sufficiently vote as a bloc to defeat usually the minority group's preferred candidates. But kind of to boil down a few points in English is, number one, I think the general approach you should think about is this. When you're looking at a map, ask yourself, are you making it harder for communities of color to elect candidates of their choice? If you are, then you might want to go back to council a little bit. The second point I want to make, and I think Representative Kauser made a really good point about the political cohesion or political polarization point. If you have a jurisdiction in which voting patterns are not politically polarized, in which people of all different races tend to consider the candidates and the political parties roughly on par with each other, or vote one way or vote the other way, depending on the election, you're in less danger of having a Voting Rights Act violation. But if you're in a jurisdiction where it's very polarized, then you have to look a lot more carefully. The third point I wanted to make is about communities of interest, which are talked about a lot. When you use communities of interest as a factor, if you choose to do so, you really got to make sure that it's not masquerading for race. So for example, sometimes several years ago, there was an attempt to draw several thousand white voters into one district and several thousand Black voters out of a district. And the justification that was used was, well, we're trying to protect suburban communities of interest. And number one, suburbans are obviously not a racial monolith, but you have to be careful when you look at communities of interest, not not to use it as a masquerade for committing a Voting Rights Act violation. The two most common ways in which the Voting Rights Act is violated is through cracking and packing. Cracking refers to the fragmenting concentrations of minority populations and dispersing them among other districts to basically dilute their vote, to ensure that other districts remain majority white. Packing, which is actually the tactic that has seen a little bit of popularity in recent years, is concentrating as many people of color as possible in as few districts as possible to minimize the number of majority minority districts. Specifically, we have really seen situations where, let's say you have a majority Black district held at about 55% majority Black. The next census rolls around and everyone thinks, well, we should keep it 55%. But in the 10 years that have followed, many people may have left that district and diversified the surrounding areas. And so map makers will then redraw the map to recapture all of those people of color that have dispersed out and say, no, we got to keep it at 55% mechanically without doing any kind of nuanced analysis. That, the Supreme Court has found, can present a problem. And so we have to make sure that when you do a voting rights analysis, that you really consult with counsel and make sure you're doing a nuanced analysis, not an automatic percentage, and ensuring that you're not unintentionally packing minority voters in an inappropriate manner. And under the US Constitution, I think most people are familiar with this, you gotta have one person, one vote. Districts have to be equal in population for congressional districts and almost roughly equal in population for state legislative districts. And as was discussed earlier, race cannot generally be the predominant factor in drawing district lines. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague.
Thank you, Sean. And we are going to finish up the last parts of this to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So we'd love to hear from the committee. So looking at going back to fairness and transparency, again, asking our members and people from the public, really, what do they want within this process? And that's simple. It's that they want a criteria for the maps to provide substantial feedback on the draft maps. So looking at draft maps, we should make sure that it's publicly available to everyone, easy to decipher. A lot of times these maps are drawn in codes that most people do not have the resources to read or to actually really analyze. This has not been the case previously. So transparency also requires that the public receive adequate notice of meetings and the meetings accessible to all people. So it's great that we're doing these things virtually and also in person, but we also want to make sure that the people are having adequate notice within the process. Our calls really deal with diversity, something that we had talked about earlier. For example, HBCUs in the state of Georgia, very diverse campuses, but some of them are in different districts altogether. So this makes voting and civic engagement more accessible for students if they're actually within each other. So for example, the AUC, which composes Morehouse, Spelman, and Clark Atlanta University and Morris Brown, split up into different House districts and also different Senate districts, something that you should take into consideration. Georgians deserve fair maps. So in the current atmosphere that we have of misinformation, dealing with transparency, fairness, are key to preserving faith within this process and confidence within our democracy. The growing diversity in our state that's changed from 2010 to 2021, we must draw maps that ensure voters of color have the same opportunity to elect as a choice of everyone else within this state. So fair maps are crucial for preserving our democracy. With that, I'll yield to questions with my legal director.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bruce. And we have, who's 25? Is that, oh, Senator Cowser.
Mr. Chairman, can I direct this to Mr. Young? I think he was the legal director.
I saw that coming.
Yes, sir.
You're off the hook.
I sincerely apologize for calling you Representative Cowser.
I'm not worried about that.
It's going to be a long morning for you, sir.
You were mentioning that, Section 2 applies to this process. I had asked the previous speaker, but basically, is it your position we are required to draw majority minority districts to comply with Section 2?
Depending on the circumstances, yes, and that's why it's such a nuanced analysis. You have to look at the history of voting in this specific jurisdiction. You have to look at whether there are geographically compact communities of color, whether they've been able to elect candidates of their choice or not. And if not, then you may need to ensure that there's a sufficient number of people of color in the district to elect candidates of their choice.
So what's the nuance there? Sufficient number versus majority minority?
So sufficient number meaning it depends on voting patterns. So for example, and I'm going to oversimplify a lot of factors, but in one district, you might need a 50% Black voting age population to ensure that candidates of their choice are elected. But in another district, it might be about 55% or 45%. It just depends on the analysis in that jurisdiction.
Well, is it your belief that our voting is racially polarized here in Georgia?
Based on the cases that I am familiar with in Georgia, the answer so far has been yes, in those jurisdictions in which lawsuits have been filed.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Nix, didn't see your light on. Yes, sir, you have the mic.
Thank you. Mr. Bruce mentioned early on, talking about the growth in population, that the minority populations have grown in a more compact area. How do we work with that in terms of the compactness of the area, the communities of interest, and how do we draw those maps to include that, but yet not look like we're packing an area? That kind of created its own issue with the way that the population grew. So how do you define the community of interest, and then how do you prioritize, is it compactness we're looking for, or is it community of interest we're looking for as we draw the maps?
I think to answer your question in a more technical manner, Voting Rights Act trumps everything other than the U.S. Constitution. I think one way you start with is by looking at the district that you're redrawing, and again, looking at those voting patterns and seeing if communities of color have been able to elect candidates of their choice, and what percentage of that district is people of color. What is that percentage that has been able to allow them to do that? If the population has started to disperse, and you don't need such a high percentage of people of color to elect candidates of their choice, then you likely should not be redrawing to recapture all of those folks that have dispersed. And so that's what I would start with, is the voting history of the district you're redrawing.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Chairman Mullis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. Mr. Bruce, this is for you. In your presentation at the beginning, you talked about pre-clearance. Do you think Georgia should be placed back into the pre-clearance category and now therefore be under the Biden administration for pre-clearance?
Well, thank you for the question, Chair. And I absolutely believe that pre-clearance should be implemented again, and also the passage of HR 1 and HR 4, the For the People's Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It doesn't matter about the administration. It really matters about justice overall.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, with that, we are closing in on our 20 minutes, and I don't see any other questions. Yes, sir.
I'm just going to make one more comment.
Sure.
It has been a pleasure to be in front of you all of these times. There has been an ACLU member at every one of the meetings and hearings, or we've had ACLU members actually there, or staff members there, and they've really enjoyed the process. They want more from it, though. So it's really invigorating the community. The more you talk to them, the more feedback you'll get.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Bruce. Thanks for being with us this morning. All right. Next, we'll hear from Galeo. Mr. Gonzalez? Nope.
Actually, yeah. NAACP, can you just?
Yep. Senator Harbison.
Thank you, Mr.
Recognize
Chair.
you.
Yes, sir. I am curious about the NAACP slot, and the reason is because I had several calls from a representative, namely Mr. Ed Dubose, who's with the state NAACP, wanting to make a presentation. And I believe I heard from the chair that they could not be reached or something to that effect.
Well, no, sir.
I spoke to you about that.
We communicated, yes, sir, over the last few days. And so someone from the NAACP had been communicating with our staff, and then they went radio silent. We didn't hear anything from them. You reached out to me, and I gave you additional information and said, reach back out to me. And I didn't hear from you, Senator, anymore about that. I've not heard from the group. Is there anyone here from the NAACP?
I spoke to you. I was waiting to hear from your office regarding that. And they called me back regarding that. And I told them that they were concerned whether the meeting was open, et cetera. And apparently there's some kind of, because I certainly was advocating for them to maintain contact. So I can't figure out why they would not be here for such a time to make a presentation.
Yes, sir. And again, our communications have been responsive to them. In fact, I think Allie Farmer with my office had last sent multiple emails back to whomever was sending emails and reaching out to us, and nobody else responded. And that's why I had told you, please have them contact me personally or do what we can to help facilitate that.
I didn't understand you say have them contact you. I didn't understand. We didn't have that conversation.
Okay.
What you and I talked about was the fact, and you said you'll have your office contact me.
Yes, sir.
And I didn't get contacted by your office at all.
Okay. Well, I'll follow back up on that.
And I understand you were talking also to the minority leader, and Senator Butler.
There was a question from the minority leader about some timing and some details for the meetings, and also about that as well. But Senator, I'll reach out to Allie as well, but she made multiple attempts and responded multiple times to the person that had reached out to us, and they stopped the communications. I want to make sure we're clear about that. Okay. All right. Thank you. And I'm Chairman Rich, you have something to add?
One, yeah. Okay, we just want to make sure that the NAACP, we put you on the schedule because we wanted to hear from you. And we were hopeful that that the NAACP would appear and present. And we do want to hear from the NAACP. I understand that there apparently has been some interjection with communication that may have caused them to not come here, but that was separate from our office and committee. So we would invite the NAACP to please present something in writing to us. We want to hear from you. That's why we invited you and why we reached out. It's why we put you on the calendar here today.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chairman Rich, for that additional clarification. All right, Galeo. Mr. Gonzalez.
Good morning. Thank you, committee members, for the opportunity to be here with you all today. My name is Jerry Gonzalez. I am Chief Executive Officer of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials, also known as GALEO, the GALEO Latino Community Development Fund, and the GALEO Impact Fund. Our organizations are focused on promoting civic engagement and leadership development of the Latinx community in Georgia. Our promise to our community is to build a better Georgia where our communities are respected and honored for our significant contributions to our state. GALEO was started in 2003 by then State Senator Zamarripa and State Representative Pedro Marin, along with myself as its founding executive director. Our idea was to create a catalyst of engagement of the Latino Hispanic community in our state to ensure our voices were heard, respected, and courted for policy matters that impact our communities directly. GALEO focused our work to ensure our community is engaged, involved in policy decisions, and are active participants in our democracy. We assist eligible citizens to vote, often overcoming language access barriers. We encourage Latinx voters to turn out to vote in all elections. Our organization has assisted newly naturalized citizens to register to vote in naturalization ceremonies, where we have successfully assisted over 40,000 new Americans with the voter registration process. We have assisted legal permanent residents with their citizenship applications in order for them to become U.S. citizens and participate further in our communities, including exercising the right to vote. We have assisted DACA to apply for their work permits in the years past. We have encouraged participation of all Latinos in 2 census enumerations in both 2010 and 2020. We have advocated this legislature in favor of pro-immigrant policy solutions and also advocated against anti-immigrant initiatives. We even testified during the last redistricting cycle in 2011 against the legislative maps because of intentional dilution of the Latino community's ability to elect candidates of choice, especially in Gainesville, where the city was carved up into several districts to avoid minority-majority population thresholds. We have advocated for a federal solution to our broken immigration system, and we are supportive of current efforts for some immigration reform relief through the congressional budget reconciliation process. Under our leadership development efforts, we have graduated over 687 people from our annual and statewide Galileo Institute for Leadership, with our current cohort of over 25 participants scheduled to graduate in November. We have partnered with Georgia State University to provide our leadership skills development to Latinx scholars for several years now. We have conducted several annual Latino Leaders Summit, where Latinx community members continue to come together to learn about our policy priorities and how to engage with policymakers, enhance their professional and community organizing skills. Furthermore, we have also conducted Latino leadership series in both English and Spanish in Savannah, Columbus, and we are going to Dalton for our next one. Due to the ongoing pandemic, we do hold many activities via Zoom, also stream them on Facebook Live for greater access to our communities. Since 2003, the Latino electorate and the Latinx community have clearly grown into the fabric of Georgia and are an integral part of our present and a significant factor for our state's future. To begin with, the Latino electorate has grown from just 10,000 voters in 2003 when we were founded to well over 385,000 voters in our most recent 2020 elections, representing about 4% of Georgia's overall electorate. In the report we recently published, we documented that the Latino electorate grew by 141,000 voters since the 2016 election alone, demonstrating a growth rate about 58%. The report is significant because we partner with the Naleo Educational Fund to conduct a surname match of the electorate, which otherwise would miss about 35% of the Latinx electorate. More information about that process is available in the report, and all of you should have received a letter from me on the release of the report, and a link to the report was provided to you all. The majority of the Georgia Latino electorate is under the age of 40 and has registered to vote as early as 2020. Also, most of the electorate is female, and Latinas outpace their male counterparts in voter participation. The top metro Atlanta counties also account for a large share of the Latino electorate. The top 10 counties account for 62.3% of the entire Georgia Latino electorate and account for 64.7% of the Latino voter turnout in the 2020 election. In the top 5 congressional districts, the Latino vote had a prominent force compared to previous years. Most of the Latino voter density resides in the Metro Atlanta congressional districts. Latino voters in congressional districts number 6 and number 11 had the highest Latino voter participation rates in the states, with 62.4% and 57.9% voter turnout, respectively. The Georgia legislative districts also indicated growth in total number of Latino voters, with the top 5 districts almost doubling the amount of voter registration and voters of 2016. On a national level, the Latino vote increased by 6 million voters since the 2016 election cycle, approaching a record number of 18.7 million voters in 2020. Reportedly, 1 in 10 voters was Latino in 2020. Additionally, younger Latinos ages 18 to 40, with about 2.4 million voters, were first-time newly registered voters. And the Latina vote was vital in many battleground states like Florida, Texas, Arizona, and yes, even Georgia. The US Census Bureau released new population data showcasing the multiracial growth of the United States. In Georgia, there was a growth of 10.57% of the total population compared to the last census. Furthermore, the Hispanic community grew by 31.6%, and it accounted for 26.3% of Georgia's overall growth. I'll repeat that. The Hispanic community, which is about 10% of the state's population, accounted for 26.3% of our state's growth. The census data release demonstrates the continued growth and strength of the Latinx community in Georgia. The census is about power and money. As the Georgia legislature begins to draw lines for district maps, communities' interests should be taken into account. Legislative and local districts should be drawn to ensure that communities responsible for the growth get their fair share of both power and resources. As the Georgia legislature will soon convene for a redistricting special session, we hope that you will respect the multiracial change in our state and ensure appropriate maps are drawn to provide a more representative democracy that reflects Georgia's growing diversity. Our communities would also want for greater transparency of the redistricting process. To date, the legislature has conducted several hearings across the state with significant input from community members demanding the same thing, greater transparency. We need greater clarity on the process. We would like to know the timeline of the maps being drawn, the timeline of when the maps are proposed, to when and how community members can access and possibly submit alternative maps directly to the Georgia legislature. Georgians need to have access to the maps and have an understanding of how and when the proposed maps will be presented. Georgians should also have the ability to substantially comment and raise questions and concerns from legislators in the process. Will everyday Georgians have access to the reapportionment legislative office, or will it be for politicians only? If so, what would that process be? What will the process and timeline be for local redistricting efforts? Will this be done during the special legislative session or during the regularly scheduled legislative session in 2022? These are some questions that deserve answers for Georgians to understand, which would enable Georgians to further engage in our redistricting process. Given this legislative body's passage of the most recent voter suppression law, SB 202, there are concerns that the redistricting efforts will also be a form of voter suppression against people of color in our state. Redistricting maps should meet the core underlying principles and legal protections of the Voting Rights Act. Our communities are rightly concerned about tactics to undermine communities of color's ability to elect candidates of choice through packing, cracking, and voter dilution. We also do know from many years of data and analysis that race is a proxy for partisanship, especially in the Deep South. Because of this, there are strong concerns regarding the declining white population, and the increasing communities of color population will lead to intentional discrimination against voters of color through the redistricting process. Coalition districts of Black, AAPI, and Latinx communities should be considered in order to elect candidates of choice for our communities of color. The values and interests across our communities of color indicate a strong alignment on issues like education, access to healthcare, pandemic relief, immigration, and voting rights issues. Many Georgians have already expressed their interest for more transparency. Y también muchos de nuestra comunidad les avisaron que era necesario de tener acceso para personas que no hablen inglés. Y ustedes desafortunadamente ignoraron a nuestra comunidad. There has been no effort to make any of this process more accessible to those who do not speak English, even as our communities across the state continue to diversify. So far, legislators have not provided any feedback or responses to the concerns and questions raised by constituencies across the state with the initial set of redistricting hearings. There has been no information shared about the process nor the timeline. We all know both the electorate and the census enumeration indicate a decline of white voters and an increase in voters of color. Communities of color share similar values and interests and should have a right to elect candidates of their choosing. This legislative process should respect and honor both the growth of the electorate and population, with fair districts drawn to the benefits of communities that are driving the growth for our state. Thank you. And I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you all may have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Representative Fleming?
Thank you, sir. You referenced race and several times in your comments, and you heard earlier about racially polarized voting as a legal concept. Setting aside whether we agree or disagree with the concept, does racially polarized voting have an impact on how we draw the district lines here in Georgia?
I think it all depends on the context, as was referenced by the legal director of the ACLU. Context means everything. Voting history, as well as the communities that we're talking about in those voting districts, need to be taken into account associated with that. But from my understanding, the litigation that has been brought forth, there is a proxy for race.
Okay. Is it your opinion that we should be drawing districts where the minority community has ability to elect candidates of choice in the House and the Senate and the congressional districts in Georgia?
That would be fair consideration for you all to consider, because that would mean that you're taking into consideration the growing diversity of our state and respecting that growth with drawing fair districts to ensure that communities of color in particular can elect their own candidates of choice.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Any other questions? Chairman Mullis, did you?
Hey, you didn't talk about pre-clearance, but I want to go back as I asked Mr. Bruce. You think Georgia should be pre-cleared like it was in the past and now and therefore the Biden administration?
I think that certainly Georgia's history is one for the history books, and voter suppression is common in Georgia's history. Given that, I do believe that pre-clearance needs to be reestablished for Georgia under any administration, because justice and fairness under the law, it would require that enforcement regardless of the administration. So yes, I do believe, and I think legislative matters being considered in Congress right now would put Georgia back into pre-clearance. So I would be in favor of that, and our organization would be in favor of that.
Now, your organization was only created in, I guess, recent years, because I remember, and of course I served with Sam Zamarripa, and he was a fine man. But your organization wasn't involved in 2001, was it?
No, sir. We were founded in 2003.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mullis. All right. Seeing no other questions, Mr. Gonzalez, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, sir. Okay. Next, we have Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and I think they're appearing virtually. Okay. So if you, if you're on the call, if you can unmute yourself now.
Yes, we are here. It will be myself, Lavita Tuff, the policy director, and Karuna Ramachandran is also here as well with us.
Okay, very good. Thank you for being with us, and you have the floor.
Yes, sir. We are trying to share our screen. Okay. Perfect. Can everyone hear us?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Lavita Tuff, and I'm the policy director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. And we are in a point in period of our work where we entitle it AAPI Rising, because we understand that the Asian American Pacific Islander community here in Georgia is rising and taking charge. Like I said, my name is Lavita Tuff, and I'm joined today by Karuna Ramachandran, our statewide partnerships director. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are. Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta is the first and only nonprofit legal advocacy organization dedicated to protecting the civil rights of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in Georgia and the Southeast. Our work is not done in a vacuum. We do it across racial lines and in solidarity with lots of other folks and folks that you've heard from today. That work includes working and leading with the Georgia Immigrant Rights Alliance and making sure that we're amplifying the voice of immigrant communities across Georgia. Understanding that the AAPI community has continued to grow at a significant rate, we know that there are 238,080 eligible AAPI voters, which makes up 4.7% of the electorate in the state. That is 138% AAP population growth rate since 2000. We also know that more than 200,000 AAPI Georgians voted in the 2020 general election, which was more than a 60% increase from 2016. 3 out of 10 AAPI Georgians who voted in the 2020 general election were first-time voters. What we say at Advancing Justice Atlanta is that what we're doing is building a culture of civic engagement that we must build upon and keep the conversation going. Asian Americans care deeply about the economy, about healthcare, about education and immigration. But most importantly, Asian Americans care deeply about voting rights. SB 202's restrictions on absentee voting by mail disproportionately impact AAPI voters in Georgia. With that, we also understand that 80% of Asian Americans in Georgia speak a language other than English at home, and 44% of Asian Americans that speak another language at home speak English less than very well. That is why we're calling for language equity. During this entire process, we have, submitted letters, we've submitted testimony, we've testified in person about the importance of language equity. And language equity for us is very different than language access. Language access says we're going to give you an opportunity to have access to these materials, to have access to a process. But for us, language equity goes a little bit further. It's about being intentional. It's about being deliberate about creating that access and maintaining it so that there's an equal playing field for folks to be able to communicate and participate fully in all parts of society. And that's really important for limited English proficient Georgians who want to be a part of the redistricting process. AAPIs are the fastest growing minority population in Georgia. As you've heard from our colleagues at the ACLU and at Galileo, our immigrant communities across Georgia are growing at a significant rate. And what we cannot do is ignore them or leave them out of the process of redistricting. Their voices, their concerns matter and should be heard and included in this process. I'll now pass it over to Karuna to go into the census.
Thank you, Levita. And thank you for your patience with me as I struggle with some internet connectivity. Thank you to the chairs for inviting us here today. I'm very happy to be here with you. As the results of the 2020 census confirm, what those of us in the community have known for years is that the Asian American
Ma'am, can you hear me? We've lost your audio.
I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we have you back now. Thank you.
I see. Okay. So since 2010, the Asian American population has jumped 53% or more and is now 4.5% of the total population of Georgia. And so the Asian American community is very diverse with multiple ethnicities and multiple different languages being spoken by community members. And it's not only the Asian American community, as we've heard from other speakers, the Black community, the Latinx community is booming here as well. And, according to the Census Bureau's racial and ethnic diversity has increased incredibly for Georgia. We're among one of the top 10 states with the highest diversity index. And so Georgia is already on track to becoming a majority minority state with a rich, multiracial, multi-ethnic population that brings, many benefits to our state. And so we work in unity with Black and Latinx community members to ensure that none of our communities are disenfranchised through the redistricting process. And we're very concerned that as the state's population becomes more diverse, that the legislature must ensure equitable opportunities for communities of color to elect candidates of choice. And next slide, please. And while we appreciate the opportunity to present today, we must also point out
We've lost your audio again. Are you still there? Are you there?
I will pick it up for Karuna, since we seem to be having some audio challenges. I'll pick up for our shortcoming slide. So some of the shortcomings of the current redistricting process include no response to public demand for more information and transparency, an entire process that was conducted in English only, and no commitment to meaningful public input and accessibility. As we showed you on the previous slides, language equity is extremely important to us. And so this process shortchanges so many Georgians when it's conducted in an English only way, and where there's no commitment to a very meaningful public input and accessibility for all Georgians. And because the immigrant communities across Georgia are so diverse and make up a significant portion of the population, we cannot continue to ignore their voices just as much as we want to count their votes. So as our organization has continued to move in trying to provide some language equity support and resources for the community, there have been questions about the redistricting process. And some of those questions include, when is the special session set to start? How long will it be? Is the legislature expecting to work on local redistricting during the special session? Where can the public find guidelines, timeline, and rules for the process for redistricting and mapping? And will the Georgia legislature release a list of all factors taken into account when developing redistricting plans? There are a number of questions surrounding this process that the community just doesn't have an answer to. And as we get closer and closer to what we deem to be the timeline for special session, we do believe that the community should have more information and access to resources about how this process will play out for the communities across Georgia, especially for the AAPI community. Our questions continue with, how will the Georgia legislature seek to ensure that the state's growing communities of color will not be disenfranchised through practices such as incumbency protection, racial and partisan gerrymandering? Will the public be allowed to give input on those draft maps? And how can the public submit their own maps to the legislature? Going on, will the joint committees respond to these submissions and public input and state their actions with regard to these items? Will the redistricting process be made accessible to the public regardless of language spoken or disability, and if so, how? And given the COVID-19 resurgence, how will the legislature take virtual or remote testimony? All these questions have been asked in the letters that we posed questions to you all, in the testimony that we provided in other hearings around the state, and the letters we've written in written testimony, and the questions we sent in email, none of which have been answered. And so what we're doing here today is asking and demanding that there be answers to the questions surrounding this process, so that we can educate our community members on how they can be a part of the process and have a meaningful opportunity to fully participate in it as well. And that is all for our presentation, unless my counterpart has anything else.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. All right, Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. It was very thorough, and I have a great appreciation for it. I have a daughter-in-law of Asian descent, so it is very important that everyone is heard of and heard from. But you've explained the growth of the Asian communities, and that is wonderful news. I think we all appreciate that. But given that growth, what are your recommendations about the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as it applies to our Asian communities in Georgia?
So our recommendations when it comes to the Voting Rights Act and other legislation that's poised to try to increase the opportunity to practice in our democracy is that there be a meaningful way for there to be language access and language equity for all LEP voters across the country. And so for us, like we said, 44% of AAPI voters our LEP. And so what we would like to see in that section 2 is that section 203 be revised with that formula for how we distribute information, who's required to distribute information. In the jurisdictions right now in Georgia, Gwinnett County is the only county that has to be a section 203 jurisdiction to abide by providing materials in language. And we know that Gwinnett County has a large growing AAPI population. If that formula was revisited and that threshold was diminished, then we know that more Asian languages would be qualified to get voting materials in language. And so what we don't want to do is wait on the federal government to do that. We ask the state to start doing that as well.
If I could follow up, Mr. Chairman. In your experience as Asian individuals, are they, from county to county, are they politically the same or are they different depending on the communities they're in?
Just like the languages of the AAPI community are diverse, we know that their political views are diverse as well. What we do have is a common goal of wanting to be heard and having meaningful access to the process.
Thank you.
Right. Senator Mullis.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for being here with us today. When was the Asian American Advancing Justice created? What year?
If I'm not mistaken, 2010, Karina.
Okay. All right. Well, we're grateful for that organization. So you wouldn't have been here, or your organization wouldn't have been here in 2001 for the redistricting reapportionment process at that time.
Well, sir, as a native Georgian who was from Atlanta and a North Atlanta High School proud grad, I would say that I actually was in Georgia, and a lot of our staff were here in Georgia when this took place. And so what we do is bring a wealth of knowledge about our experience as Georgians to this process and what our communities would like to see. And so there have been members of our staff and consultants who participated in this process, but as an organization in whole, I cannot state that has been done.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Senator Mullis. All right, I don't see any other questions. So with that, thank you very much for your presentation today to the both of you.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to move on now to the League of Women Voters. Okay, and I understand you're in the Zoom room, so if you can unmute yourself and let us know, speak for a moment, make sure we can hear you, please.
Susanna Scott is our presenter this morning. I don't see her on the Zoom.
And she is not, according to what we're seeing as well.
Well, I can go ahead and start if.
Yes, ma'am. Are you Miss Boland?
I am. I'm Julie
Okay.
Boland.
All right, very good. Then we'll be happy to hear from you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, and if Susanna joins us, she can pick it up from,
Yes,
from
ma'am.
where I stopped.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, Chairman Rich and Senator Kennedy and the members of the Joint Redistricting Committee. My name is Julie Boland. I'm a member of the board of the League of Women Voters, and I'm also the redistricting chair. Thank you for inviting us to speak to you this morning. The League was established in 1920, fighting for the right for women to vote. It's grown into a unique, nonpartisan organization that's recognized as one of the most effective grassroots organizations in the country. Our mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. We applaud your committee for holding 11 hearings across the state, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. These hearings have been a good start to let the public share their concerns about redistricting with you. The next step is for you to answer questions about the process. A two-way dialogue is needed. My comments today will focus on the League's biggest concern with the redistricting process in Georgia, which is the lack of transparency. This is also a concern for most of the citizens of Georgia who spoke at the recent hearings held by this committee. We heard, and I'm sure you did too, a resounding message that Georgians want a fair, transparent redistricting process that results in maps that respond to the needs of citizens over those of political parties and politicians. Polling indicates that members of both parties want a fair, transparent process, as exemplified by the public comments at hearings of the joint committees held in July and August. where the top three issues raised were fairness, the need for public input, and transparency. We acknowledge that the legislature isn't required by the Georgia Constitution to be transparent in drawing new district lines. However, Georgians across the political spectrum have made it clear that they expect it. Conducting redistricting in secret raises concerns about what legislators are hiding. If your committees are conducting a fair redistricting process that doesn't confer partisan advantage, protect incumbents, or disadvantage minorities, shouldn't your methods and results be made available for public scrutiny? Secrecy intensifies public mistrust of public officials and the entire redistricting process at a time when trust is at an all-time low. I will stop for a minute. I see Suzanne has joined us.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was having connection issues myself. Thank you, Julie, for jumping in. And thank you, committee, for bearing with us in my technical issues. So just to carry on from what Julie was saying, unfair redistricting discourages participation in elections. Our democracy is harmed when districts are gerrymandered so that only one party has any hope of winning an election. Georgia's elections for state office are notoriously uncompetitive, with a high proportion of uncontested races. According to Ballotpedia, 51% of state legislative races and 76% of local races were uncontested in 2020. This is a direct result of gerrymandering. Elected officials run unopposed because political candidates know that they can't win in a gerrymandered district. This seriously impacts the opportunity to have open discussions about the needs and concerns of any given district during the election season. Contested elections allow all candidates the chance to debate ideas and voters the chance to vote for the ideas and solutions that they believe will best serve their communities. Creating districts that do not encourage this type of public discourse and exchange of ideas not only diminishes voters' belief in the value of their vote, but also eliminates the introduction of new ideas and solutions that make our democracy healthy and vibrant. We have heard members of the legislature say that transparency is not needed. They contend that they were elected to do this job and the public should trust that they will conduct a fair process. The testimony you have heard over the past few months should demonstrate to you that the public does not agree that transparency isn't needed. The redrawing of legislative maps directly affects the everyday life of every person living in Georgia. Georgians have a right to know how and why these decisions are being made. We have the right to see proposed maps and be given sufficient time to provide input before the maps are written into law. Here are some of the things you can do to help restore public trust in the redistricting process. 1, establish an easily accessible online platform or hold public forums that allow citizens to ask questions and to get answers about the redistricting process in a timely manner. 2, adopt rules and guidelines for the special legislative session to finalize maps and post them online before the special session begins. Currently, the public has no information on how the Senate and House committees are redrawing maps or any rationale or guiding principles for the decisions they are making. 3, hold public meetings that are live streamed and recorded as your committee makes decisions about district lines. Make sure the meetings are accessible to all Georgians. Use a format that makes them accessible to people with disabilities and those whose primary language is not English. 4, publish draft maps as soon as possible and establish a process for the public to submit alternative maps online for consideration by the committee. And 5, work with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project to utilize benchmarks to evaluate the fairness of draft maps. All of these steps will serve to restore trust in our system and to encourage all Georgians to participate. We want to thank you for the work you're doing, and Julie and I are happy to take questions.
Thank you. Chairman Smith.
Thank you, sir. And thank the League of Women Voters, because I attended probably 90% of all those public hearings, and I think y'all were at each one. And it was a pleasure to listen to what your comments were. I've got a two-part question for you. Been scribbling some notes here and based on some of the comments that you made, and actually some of the other folks' comments. Do you have a recommendation about the best way to gather public input on maps once they're drawn? And the second part of that is, what if there isn't time? Are there other options?
Thank you for that question. And I think making sure that you are publicizing them on your website and making sure that the community has access to those maps is going to be key. And then having a place, on your website, on the joint website, or each house, the House and the Senate committee websites, where people can submit their proposed maps. There are a lot of mapping tools out there, and a lot of Georgians are learning how to use them so that they can talk to you guys about what they're looking for in their maps. So having a website where they can upload those maps would be really beneficial. And in terms of time, that is, I think, everyone's biggest concern is the fact that there is not a lot of time in this process. So my recommendation would be to make that website where people can upload maps available as soon as possible, even before you've met, so that you can see what your constituents are looking for in maps and can evaluate them as you're doing the drafting process.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the great-great-granddaughter of a suffragette, I'm very much in need of making sure that women are still voters, and I appreciate your being here today. But some of the things that I'm noticing and we hear repeatedly, and this is something you might be able to voice your opinion on. Do you agree that we should try to keep our counties and precincts whole as much as it is to decrease the work on our election officials as they work there, which, by the way, most of them are women, as well as to keep our communities together?
I think where possible, that that should be a goal. Counties, especially your rural counties, they're going to have a lot of common interests, and a lot of the issues that matter to them are going to be similar. I know it's going to be harder in more populous counties to keep the full county together, obviously, but where possible. I think we heard at your Macon hearing, a lot of people were concerned about keeping the Macon-Bibb area consolidated because they consider themselves a voting block. And Habersham and Toombs, I think, also expressed that interest. So we know that our citizens in counties really want to try and stay as compact as possible and keep those counties as whole as possible. Recognizing it can't always be done, but where possible, I think that should be one of the goals.
Thank you. And thank you for your members that attended our meetings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Mullis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the League of Women Voters for being a part of this open forum, and I'm grateful you've been here. Now, this joint committee has had many meetings across the state, I'd say pre-redistricting. And in 2011, they had pre-redistricting meetings all through the state. Now, I don't recall your organization. I know you were created before 2001, and there was no transparency. There was no pre-meetings across the state. And the first time that the public and the minority party saw the map was in the reapportionment meeting prior to it going to the floor. Why were y'all not here condemning that process? You remember?
Well, in 2001, I was in grad school out of the country, so I can't speak to what was happening then. But I know that it has been a longstanding issue of the League of Women Voters. We were established February 14th, 1920 in anticipation of passage of the 19th Amendment. So we have been here. We have always believed in good government. And Again, I can't speak to our presence or lack thereof in 2000, but I do know that this has been a longstanding concern since I have been an active member of the league.
Thank you for your comment.
Okay, and we'll wrap up the questioning with Chairman Rich.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. You spoke of the importance of having competitive, electorally competitive districts. Do you believe that that is a more important principle or guideline? Should that be prioritized over the traditional redistricting principles of keeping precincts and counties whole?
I think they're both important. And I think if we're talking about keeping counties whole, hopefully that will lead to competitiveness. I cannot speak to exactly how many counties. I can look into it, but I can't speak off the top of my head how competitive counties that have been kept whole have been. I think there are competing interests, and I mean, we are going to have to rely on your judgment and weighing those and trying to make districts as competitive as possible while also keeping precincts and districts as whole, or counties as whole as possible. So I recognize it's not an easy challenge, but I think we've got to weigh all of those issues and try to come to as close to as best of a solution as possible. Recognize you're not going to make everyone happy all the time, but if you're at least considering all of those, I think you're well on your way to creating fairer maps.
So you, just so I understand, you don't have an opinion as to which one should take priority, creating competitive districts or keeping counties and precincts whole?
My position is I think we need competitive districts. I think it's better for the fair exchange of ideas. But I think a very close second is keeping county districts whole.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so thank you very much for the presentation this morning.
Thank you all for having us. We appreciate your work.
Thank you.
All right, next we're going to hear from the Georgia Democratic Party, and I think they also are appearing virtually. So if you are with us and they are in the Zoom room, if you would unmute yourself, let us know that we can hear you, and then you'll be free to begin.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. My name is Sachin Varghese. I'm General Counsel for the Democratic Party of Georgia. I appreciate Chairs Kennedy and Rich opening this up to us and inviting us to participate, and I appreciate the committee members being here today. If you'll give me one moment, I'll share my screen with you. We can get going. Apologize, having some technical difficulties there. Okay. So here I'm going to touch on some of the high points. Obviously, other presenters have touched on many of these points, and I won't try to replow that ground. But here, just to note that I think it's clear that Georgians want and deserve fair maps. And fair maps are those that are equitable and inclusive, that allow voters of color to elect their representative of choice, and that respect communities of interest. And we've heard some about this today, and I'm happy to explore it further with questions that you have. So creating fair maps. Many of the fellow presenters have touched on the need for a transparent process that's open to the public, that provides meaningful opportunities for citizens and communities to provide feedback on proposals and to engage meaningfully with the proposed maps, and also includes adhering to sound redistricting principles, which some of you today have already touched on, such as preserving counties and some other principles we can explore further. So as you've already heard this morning, Georgia is changing. And over the last 20 years, Georgia has grown tremendously by about 2.5 million people. And that growth has primarily been driven by people of color. In the decade from 2000 to 2010, Georgia's population grew by 1.5 million people, and more than 75% of that increase was the result of growth in Georgia's Black, Hispanic, or Latino and Asian communities. Similarly, in the last decade, the growth, Georgia grew by almost 1 million residents, and again, more than 75% of that increase was the result of growth in Georgia's Black, Hispanic, or Latino and Asian communities. Another aspect to the changing face of Georgia is that over the last decade, Georgia has become increasingly competitive politically. And over the last 2 cycles, Republicans and Democrats have each obtained about 50% of the statewide vote. And so moving forward and focusing on what we're doing this time, we think the process can be improved. In 2011, voters of color were cracked and packed in the state house, state senate, and congressional maps. Black incumbents generally, but particularly Black incumbents, were unnecessarily paired in the House and Senate maps, and those maps resulted in hyperpartisan maps that were uncompetitive. The ACLU earlier touched on cracking and packing, but essentially cracking is splitting a racial minority community into 2 or more districts so that the minority community is not a significant portion of a single district, whereas packing is concentrating a racial minority community in fewer districts to minimize their influence elsewhere. So I point to Congressional District 12 in 2011 just as one example. There are others in the House maps and the Senate maps, but just taking a look at Congressional District 12, one thing that's worth noting before we dive into this is that 1.5 million additional Georgians that we talked about that the state added from 2000 to 2010, 600,000 of those were Black residents. And that's almost enough people to create an additional congressional district by itself based on equal population in 2011. So in the 2011 plan, the benchmark 12 had almost 300,000 Black residents with a Black voting age population of almost 41%. And that district deviated from the ideal by only 554 people. It had the least deviation of any congressional district going into that redistricting plan. In the enacted plan, more than 60,000 Black residents were removed from Congressional District 12. They were placed in 2 surrounding districts where they did not have the opportunity to elect candidates of choice, and the Black voting age population of Congressional District 12 was reduced from 41% to a little less than 33%. And so that's an example of cracking of voters of color that occurred in the last cycle that we shouldn't repeat in this cycle. That's all I have in terms of a presentation, and I welcome any questions from the committees. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Chairman Rich.
Thank you for being here. I was surprised to hear you state that the 2011 maps were drawn and packed and cracked minority districts, which I understand that would be illegal. Those would be illegal maps. So if that is the case, then why did the Obama Justice Department approved those maps? And why was there no litigation on the issue until halfway through the decade?
Sure. So with regards to pre-clearance, that applies to Section 5, and the Obama Justice Department did pre-clear those maps, and they got it wrong, just as I've told Attorney General Eric Holder to his face. And as you noted, there was not litigation. And the fact is, the Obama Justice Department got it wrong in several areas, and there were other maps that were overturned in subsequent litigation.
So are you aware that the plaintiffs who sued over Congressional District 12 in 2018 dismissed their complaint?
I've not followed that litigation closely.
That's the district that you just spoke about to the committee? The
That's
district?
correct.
Yes, okay. All right, thank you. I have another serious question for you. At the beginning of this process, following in the footsteps of the redistricting chairman before me in 2011, I invited every member of the House of Representatives to meet with me to discuss his or her district, to discuss their communities of interest, to discuss their cities and counties, and some preferences that they may have for map drawing. I, to date, have met only one person from the Democratic Party who serves alongside me. That is the only one who has met with me, although there have been probably 10 who have signed up and then removed their names. So have you directed my Democratic colleagues to not come and speak with me about the needs of their districts and constituents in this redistricting process?
I have not, Chairman Rich, and I hope that invitation remains open, and anyone that wants to discuss their districts with you should do so. I can understand why there might be some wariness about how that process might unfold, particularly given how it unfolded in the last cycle, in which these meetings occurred and members were brought in and essentially shown a map proposal of an individual district in the abstract without understanding how it fit into the broader picture and surrounding districts, and without being provided information about those districts. I suspect if you were to provide members with some more framework about how those meetings will occur and what will be presented or discussed, that would ease some of that concern.
Yes, and in fact, I did do that. I did have that discussion, and yet no one, except for one member of their party has. And yes, the invitation certainly remains open. I feel that those members are doing their constituents a real disservice in not giving them the voice in this process. And it does surprise me that no one has. And I would like to invite the members of this committee from the opposing party to tell me what I need to do to hear from them in this process.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Rich. Senator Cowsert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to kind of follow up a little bit on some of these allegations that you're making, these assertions that to me seem to be just completely false. And if you don't know they are, I need to let you know so you can stop this false narrative. In your written materials, you told us that we paired incumbents, and particularly Black incumbents, to reduce minority representation. And I can tell you in the state Senate, not a single incumbent from any party was paired with each other in our redistricting maps. If you're not aware of that, you need to make a note of that before you continue this false narrative.
Thank you, Senator Cowsert, and that assertion may have spoken too broadly. In the House redistricting map in particular, there were 6 Black incumbents that were paired, 4 that were paired with white incumbents, 2 that were paired with each other.
And you're also making this false narrative that there was cracking and packing in the state Senate maps. And I think if you will look up the numbers, First of all, they were pre-cleared by Democratic administration. Number two, there was never even a court challenge filed challenging the state Senate districts as being unfair or unlawful in any way, including diluting minority voting strength through cracking or packing. And I think if you'll look up the numbers, you're going to see there are more African-American members of the state Senate today than there were when we drew these maps in 2011.
So Senator Cowser, with the 2011 plans, I can specifically point to Senate District 6, in which the African-American population was decreased. Those African-American residents were moved into Senate District 38, increasing and packing the residents in that district where they were already electing a candidate of choice. Senate District 14 was dismantled and moved to North Georgia. The Black residents of that district were split among 4 different districts.
Well, isn't that to do when you have a population reduction like South Georgia had? If you're going to honor one man, one vote, those districts had to shrink in South Georgia. The numbers shrunk of districts, and the only place where the population went was North Georgia.
I believe there were alternatives introduced, and I can't cite one specifically, Senator, but I'm happy to submit that subsequently, in which...
Would you agree with me that the last time the Democrats drew these redistricting maps in Georgia, that they were extremely gerrymandered? 2001.
Senator, I'm not here to defend what's been done in the past. What I'm focused on is what we can do this year to give Georgians fair and equitable maps that they deserve.
So you don't have a comment on that? Because I think what you're going to find that the Republican Party has handled redistricting one time in the last 100 years, and the maps were found to be fair and legal and constitutional to the point they were approved by a Democratic presidential administration, and that they were never even challenged in court because there was no grounds to challenge those maps, which is totally different than what's happened in the past. And this narrative that we're hearing is that in the past, redistricting has been partisan. And if that's the case, that was when what is the now minority party was in control of doing that map drawing. Your party.
Respectfully, Senator, I disagree that in the last cycle, voters of color weren't packed and cracked. They had fewer opportunities to elect. I certainly cannot dispute the maps were pre-cleared by the Obama Justice Department. As I've already stated, I disagree with that decision as well. And the fact that litigation was not brought is not a statement on the merits of the map. As you may well know, litigation can be often resource intensive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cowser. Representative Alexander, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to pre-clearance and why that was, how that came about.
Sure. So pre-clearance, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was added as part of the Voting Rights Act to remedy discrimination in states that had a long and established history of such discrimination against voters of color. Georgia was one of those states. That act, the last time it was reauthorized, I believe, was 2010, with strong bipartisan support in both the House and Senate, and had an extensive history supporting reauthorization that outlined the history of discrimination in covered jurisdictions, including in Georgia. That is an important piece of the Voting Rights Act. And as we've seen after the Supreme Court struck it down in the Shelby County decision in 2013, states that were covered by Section 5 have made numerous changes to voting process and procedures that disproportionately impact voters of color.
Thank you for that history lesson.
Okay, seeing no other questions. Sir, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. All right. And next we will hear from Fair Districts.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Chairs Kennedy and Rich and members of the committee. My name is Janet Grant and I am the Vice Chair of Fair Districts, Georgia. We're pleased to have the opportunity to present to you today. Fair Districts is, let me get my slides with me. Fair Districts is a grassroots citizen organization that is solely focused on advocating for fair redistricting. We are nonpartisan, a nonprofit group made up of volunteers from across the state. With me today are several of my fellow volunteers from Fair Districts, including Karen McGowan, who is our liaison with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project that we're going to talk about today. I'm here to share with you the work of Fair Districts and our partners at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. The Princeton Gerrymandering Project was formed in 2017 by Princeton professor Dr. Sam Wang and is now one of the country's premier analytical resources on redistricting and gerrymandering. They've been tapped for their expertise in the biggest Supreme Court redistricting cases over the last decade. We're excited to bring this partnership to Georgia as a resource to you and to the citizens of this state. In I'm not keeping up with my slides, sorry about that. In public town halls that you held across the state this summer, there were a number of common themes that we heard emerge, whether it was in metro Atlanta area or in rural South Georgia. And based on an analysis by GPB, the top 3 themes included 62% of those that testified that advocated for fair maps, 47% for more opportunities for public input, and 43% for transparency in the process. We echo all 3, but today, for today's conversation, we'll primarily focus on the request for fair maps. So what do we mean by fairness? First, maps should be fair by reflecting the natural political preferences of voters, not gerrymandered to give a political advantage to one party over the other. This will increase competition and real choice for voters, and competition over time breeds excellence. Maps should also reflect and support the increasing diversity of our state, which we've heard a lot about already this morning. Legally, maps must meet the basic requirements of the Voting Rights Act, but fairness, we believe, also calls for maximizing opportunity districts in which minorities and coalition have the ability to select a candidate of their choice. And finally, fairness respects communities of interest. You heard from many citizens in the public town halls that they want their communities preserved or reunited from past splits. In fact, our analysis shows that 2/3 of the small to medium cities across Georgia that could be contained in a single House district are split in as many as 6 districts. We also know from our historical analysis in Georgia and illustrated on this complicated slide that shows seat share versus vote share, that both political parties, when in power, have drawn maps to favor their party and candidates. The Democrats did do this in 2001, and those maps were struck down and eventually replaced by the courts. Since 2005, Republicans have had the advantage of redistricting leadership, not only in the decennial census, after the decennial census, but also with multiple mid-cycle redistricting bills that provided for safer districts. We believe that this history by both parties makes the case for change and a fair process going forward. Our work with Princeton brings access to sophisticated ensemble methods to establish fairness benchmarks and evaluate maps. This type of analysis, as I said, has been used in federal and state courts to demonstrate fairness or gerrymandering of maps based on partisan bias, minority representation, and competitiveness. In this process, a computer simulation is completed using census and voting data to create about 500,000 maps that comply with laws and traditional redistricting criteria. This normal bell curve is then plotted of these non-biased maps and is used to compare a proposed map to see if it fits within the expected range of that normal curve or is an outlier. And here's an example. In this generic example of a 52-seat chamber, the natural voting preferences you can see results in a slight preference for Party B, who has a range of 25 to 30 expected districts versus Party A with 22 to 27 districts. The enacted map, however, you can see is demonstrated to be an outlier, given that 98% of those 500,000 simulated non-biased maps have 1 to 5 more districts for Party A. In our recent 20-year history of redistricting in Georgia report, we demonstrated this process by looking back at the current maps that are in place today and using that 2010 census data and the 2016 to 2020 election data. And the results are summarized on this slide. So for each chamber, each map was evaluated for partisan balance, competitiveness, and minority representation. As you can see, for the State House, we found that there were 1 to 7 fewer Democratic districts than 83% of the unbiased computer simulated maps. But these districts were competitive, and minority representation actually exceeded what was expected for opportunity districts. In the Senate, however, all 3 benchmarks were not met, while for Congress, all 3 were met. With the recent release now of the 2020 raw census data, Princeton is now at work for us developing these same benchmarks for Georgia using this 2020 census data and election data from the statewide races in 2018, 2020, and 2021. We will soon be able to share with you the expected ranges for partisan balance, competitive districts, and minority representation. And we'll also be able to evaluate proposed maps for fairness using these benchmarks. So we urge you to make use of these benchmarks in the upcoming redistricting process. They can serve to demonstrate fairness of the maps with statistical justification. Benchmarks would also support the public request for transparency, demonstrates VRA compliance, and may help to avoid costly future litigation. Inviting independent benchmark and evaluation of maps will go a long way to fostering trust and confidence in redistricting. Fair Districts and Princeton stand ready to be a resource to you through this process. We're available to consult and review draft maps with these benchmarks. As you heard from many at the public town halls and was included in our April 19th coalition letter of best practice recommendations for your redistricting guidelines, time to review and comment on maps is critical for a fair process. We request a 2-week period for public review prior to committee action on proposed maps. We've also developed a dedicated webpage with resources for you as legislators in this process, and we'll continue to update that as we have more information coming forward from Princeton. Really appreciate the opportunity to present today, and now look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. We appreciate that. Let's see who we have. Dr. Senator Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for presentation today. You mentioned several times about the public comment during those hearings we had this summer, and I listened to those as well. And I heard a lot of citizens asking for counties and precincts to be kept whole, and we've heard a little bit of different comments with the different groups today. And so I wonder, where do you guys stand on that idea?
Yeah, as Susanna from League of Women Voters said, we certainly recognize that you have a very big job in front of you. And there are a lot of competing interests, and compactness or preserving communities of interest is part of that. It is a balancing act between all these pieces. We heard loud and strong from our members and from those public town halls that people were very concerned about their communities. And they gave examples, and we have many, many examples of cities that are split into 2, 3, 4, even 6 House districts, for instance, and they feel like they don't have cohesive representation. So we do think it is a very important piece to keep in mind here.
Chairman Rich.
Thank you. And I just have kind of a follow-up to that question, and it's really similar, or maybe the same question that I asked the representative from the League of Women Voters. Your presentation is a lot about creating competitive districts. So how would you rank the priority there? Is creating a competitive district more important than keeping counties and precincts whole?
Again, it's a balancing act, and I'm sorry to kind of evade the question, Chairwoman Rich, but there's a lot to take into factor. Obviously, Voting Rights Act is first criteria that has to be addressed. We believe that there absolutely can be significant increase in competitiveness in Georgia. Georgia is one of the least competitive states in the country in terms of our elections. And so there's a lot of room for improvement, but that is a balancing act with these other factors.
So the representative from the League of Women Voters thought that creating competitive districts ranked slightly higher or more important in the redistricting process as we are balancing. So when you say balance, do you feel like it should be given equal weight, or do you also think that, given the premise of your organization is to create competitive districts,
Right,
that weighs a little bit more heavily than
and some of
the
that
other?
varies by area of the state. I live in DeKalb County. It's all Democratic, districts in DeKalb County. It's very hard to draw a competitive district in DeKalb County. Whereas in another area of the state, we want to, promote where that is possible. But there's natural voting preferences that sometimes make that much more difficult. But we want to maximize, I guess I would say, competitive districts versus what we have today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Representative Chair Smith.
Presentation and the fact that several people are volunteering with this effort. I spent my whole life volunteering in my community, and I think input from individuals is very important. You're touching on a subject. I appreciate your comment that it's all about balancing. In the end, you have your premises, but we keep hearing the word fair today. And I'll just say this to you. I was president in 2001, and I had a colleague who said, I don't know if this is fair or not, but my district is contiguous at low tide. So,
Not sure that counts.
so as much academic approach we want to have, it is not easily solved. And the general premises that are intellectual are needed as guidance, but I'm very concerned that fair just seems to be an adjective, whatever a person's position is, including yours. And so how would you advise this committee that's been all over the state, that has done in-depth study of what's going on, has a limited time frame because of what we're dealing with COVID-19? So in a way, I'm acknowledging the members of the committee who are here today. I think we all carry this burden with us very personally, but some recognition needs to be given to the fact that the 2011 maps were approved by the courts and the 2001 maps were not. And all of these factors that have been brought up, I was there, were brought up in both periods of time when we had these problems. So in a way of an overview, I would really appreciate your insight, or not insight. We all are still trying to look for insight, but your observation. What do you do when we're balancing all of these different things?
So, and what we are bringing to you with these benchmarks that Princeton is working with us on is a way to evaluate that fairness. That's why we're excited about this. It is an objective way, and it's a range. We're not saying that any one map is fair, or that we're promoting a certain map, that's the fair map, because there is no one fair map. It's a balance in all of these. So if you look at the benchmarks that we used, that we developed for the history report, and what we will be developing here with the 2020 census, it's a range. We expect the partisan balance to be X to X for each party. We expect, and that's the normal curve of what we would expect. We expect for there to be, certainly minority districts that meet the Voting Rights Act, but then we expect there to be a range in terms of opportunity districts. So it is a range, but this gives an objective tool in order to evaluate.
Thank you. One follow-up, please. Again, I think what I want all of us to realize is that you yourself are trying to define, as you speak to us, what fair is. So it is not a defined, acknowledgeable legal term. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. Thank you very much to you and all the volunteers for the organization, and to the others who've spoken today. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Chair Nix.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First a comment and then a question. One, you got something in here. We talk a lot about data, and talk about 500,000 maps. We may have to start redistricting once a century if we're going to get to that level. I don't know how much data you can actually go through before it's all said and done, but somewhere along the line, you got to draw some lines. And I've asked this question before. What do you consider a community of interest, and how do you work that in with all this data? Data does not tell you interest. So what's a community of interest for you?
Yeah, and that is the art, I think, of redistricting, is taking that community of interest input into what otherwise we could just have a computer draw the maps. But there's a lot of local knowledge that is needed to understand those communities and to be able to draw maps that really do take that into account. Communities of interest can be defined a number of ways. What we heard a lot in the public town halls was people talking about their actual physical community, the town of Statesboro, the city of Macon, or the city of Athens, and being concerned about how those were split.
Get a follow-up, please?
Yes, sir.
What if the data doesn't follow that community of interest? Then what are you going to do?
Again, it's a balance. It is a balancing act. I certainly acknowledge that.
Thank you.
Representative Chair Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just sort of a comment, and it goes off of some that Representative Smith talked about. Being a Republican in a rural district that was drawn in with another Republican 10 years ago, and bouncing on what she said, I think we all need to discover that fairness, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. And that's where we're ending up. This is going to be a tough decision for all of us. And we appreciate the tools that everyone here today has brought forward to help us in that guidance. But thank you.
Ms. Grant, I want to follow up on a question, and you spoke to it just in your 2 comments ago. And we've heard comments from your organization before about splitting cities. Are you aware that of the 2005 map drawing process by the 3-judge federal district court panel for the legislative maps, where the special master prioritized cities over other geographic boundaries and was told to go back and replace those with county and precinct boundaries? Are you aware of that?
I was not aware of that. I do know that in the 2011 process that there was a 44% increase in the number of cities that were split. So it has been something that has been over time, not just at that one point in time.
Okay. And Representative Chair Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What were the, I want to explore what the criteria and the thinking was and the algorithms that the computer generates. There's a tendency, for members of the public that, computers, or the algorithms, no, algorithms are fair. They're fair and balanced. They're calling balls and strikes, but every single thing it does is infused with a methodology and an outcome that would inform the computer's decision making. It seems like what you've shared with us is the system that you use is calculated to bring about a number of legislative seats that mirrors something, whether it's the number that more closely mirrors the number of voters statewide, without respect to perhaps if there's a greater concentration of one party as voters and you draw contiguous districts, that party is going to be underrepresented numerically, perhaps because there's a greater concentration of those voters. Ultimately, it seems, so what I'm hearing you say is that the algorithm that this computer that you're using is calculated not to represent that contiguousness in the communities of interest, but rather it's calculated to bring about an outcome that mirrors a statewide average of representation. Is that true?
I think I'm going to ask Karen McGowan, who works with our Princeton team, to speak to that detail. Sure, absolutely. Thanks for the question. Yes, the ensemble of the 500,000 maps for instance, the Senate is drawn to comply with the federal and state regulations, legal requirements for a fair map. It's also
Okay, so the minimum, and I don't dispute the minimum standards will be met. I would have assumed those minimum obligations will be met. But once those minimum obligations are met, my question was, because everyone here is going to make sure those things are satisfied. But once those minimum legal obligations are met, on top of that, there's a value system that's programmed in this computer to bring about an outcome based on a set of criteria. What are those outcomes?
The objective of creating the map ensemble and then evaluating enacted maps or proposed maps against that is to reflect the Georgia's natural demographic distribution and political geography. So, it's possible that one party would have an advantage based on those criteria. But it's also the objective is to separate that natural advantage from examples of possible map manipulation or gerrymandering based on whether or not the enacted map is similar to in any way with the benchmarks that are established by the ensemble. So if, for instance, in a specific aspect of a certain district, if that district in the evaluation behaves like none of the 500 or 500,000 maps, it is an outlier. That says that probably, possibly manipulation has gone on.
But again, the word outlier, so often, and I'm not trying to, I'm just trying to draw this out somewhere. I'm not trying to be, aggressive or anything. I'm just hearing this. It seems that we control language. The idea, an outlier, the idea that the computer ran models and it's deemed an outlier. Behind that is a whole set of criteria that are programmed into the computer to establish outlier versus that which would be normalized. And what I'm hearing you say is rather than the communities of interest that we talked about, rather than keeping communities whole and the other reapportionment principles, what I've heard you say, or what's in this computer is this moving away from communities of interest and more towards a statewide outcome. If there are this many people of this population group in the state versus this, that we're trying to mirror that so that the statewide the statewide legislative distribution would match a statewide electoral vote distribution. And that's what's here. And I don't think members of the public who are listening to this understand that the idea of outlier is controlling language, but there's an underlying objective behind the system itself after meeting those minimum criteria to bring about, quote, normalized maps that match a statewide distribution of vote that matches a popular vote.
It doesn't match the popular vote. We're looking at trends, for instance, trending that if, that the statewide vote should reflect the trends in popular vote. So for instance, if the statewide vote as calculated by an average of elections that most everyone votes in, for instance, the current algorithm included an average of the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections and 2018 governor elections. What you're trying to do is establish not a specific point in time for the 20-year history, but the trend over time, that if the statewide vote drops, seat share shouldn't go up. But at the other end of the spectrum, you also ask about communities of interest. Communities of interest, computers can do a lot, and you can code a lot into an algorithm. Some things, however, are more of a part of they're an art rather than a science. Communities of interest may be one of those things. Certainly the benchmarks are an objective measurement based on a common set of algorithms that are applied both to the 500,000 maps in the ensemble and the enacted map or proposed map. So in that way, it's an apples to apples comparison. And with the idea being that, the enacted map or the proposed map should be in some way similar to the range in the ensemble maps.
Mr. Chairman, I just raised the point so the public understands there does tend to be this tendency that just as people wave science, there's sort of the computer model, there's this sort of talisman you get to wave and say, hey, I've got the computer behind me, I've got science behind me. That everything that goes into programming the algorithm is what comes out of it. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted the public to know that the Princeton model is calculated to try to mirror not communities of interest, that there's a block of folks together, whether they're in a county or a community, and that's mirrored across the state. It's rather to bend communities of interest in the direction as it's coded, bend it in the direction of trying to mirror a statewide number of legislative seats that matches popular vote versus representing communities of interest that are naturally occurring. And I want members of the public who are listening today to understand Princeton has calculated it to do exactly that. And I have no doubt that the algorithm will produce those kinds of outcomes in the quote, the maps that they're producing, that they're measuring and trying to label other maps representing communities of interest as outliers. The public needs to understand.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm not sure that I would agree with that it is attempting to bend communities of interest, that I would put it in that way. Certainly, we are evaluating the number of minority seats, of course, based on to comply with the Voting Rights Act, meaning, you cannot have fewer Voting Rights Act districts than you have with the previous map. But there are, it is also evaluating based on, say, census numbers and based on, fire department, we're adjourned.
Gee, I didn't know I was that controversial.
All right.
Gosh.
Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah.
I do appreciate the presentation.
Okay, well, maybe I should just finish
Can we
my
get,
sentence.
hold on just a moment.
I'm
Can
sorry,
we
sir.
get some confirmation is that this is a valid fire alarm, please? What's that? Okay, so let's hold on just a moment. Yeah. Well, you got one.
I don't know.
Nothing. Okay, folks, with that, we were seeking confirmation that this is valid or not, and we're not getting any information back. I think we need to respect the fire alarm that's going off. So with that, ladies, thank you very much for being with us. You were the last presenter. And with that, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. And it is true.